Okay, so Montreal Blog just posted this article, and I would like to talk about it. For those of you unaware, this is an article about the author's first-time experience going to a burlesque show as someone who has only experienced strip clubs and who doesn't really like them. Or at least that's how I would describe the article. For some, this is yet another article comparing burlesque and stripping and discussing why burlesque is so much better and so much classier than stripping. And as someone who is normally very quick to jump on that type of criticism and agree 100%, I actually think it's a bit more complicated than that. And so I'm gonna do something a little crazy and defend the article. Just a little bit, just a little. But before we start, hi, I'm Winona J. Fox. I am a burlesque performer based in Montreal, and I really enjoy analyzing burlesque in things like articles and pop fiction. So if that interests you, be sure to give me a follow or follow me on YouTube where I make longer videos on topics just like this. With that, let's talk about the article. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about this headline. I went to Montreal's only burlesque cabaret and it's nothing like a strip club. For any burlesque performers and strippers or both who have seen headlines like this, it 100% feels like just another article comparing burlesque and stripping, only to lean entirely towards burlesque and throwing stripping under the bus. And I won't lie, I can't deny that this article does posit burlesque as the more favorable of the two. That being said, this is not actually what the article is about. Instead, the article seems to act more as a pretty straightforward review, starting off with the writer talking about his experience entering into the bar, meeting the hostess. He even notes that the host acts as the stage kitten, although he calls them crew, before then breaking down the individual acts themselves, albeit briefly, and kind of discussing what made each of them different. The article also acknowledges the history of the bar and even mentions the owner and host by name. Now, if I'm being honest, this is all way more nuanced than most articles on burlesque, which usually start and end with a kind of shallow dive into beautiful women taking their clothes off, only to end with the bullshit open-ended question, but is burlesque feminist actually? It rarely goes into the performances themselves, or the setting, or the theming, or the history of the genre. And while this is by no means a perfect article, and we will get to why in just a second, there is a certain level of open-mindedness to this article that I rarely see from other reviewers of the genre, especially considering that this is the writer's first time talking about burlesque. He reviews everything from the setting, to the performances, to the drinks, to the cost, to the general vibe that it gives off. And so I do want to commend him for that, because again, I rarely see this in local publications. But now we get to the hook of the article, which is, how is this different from stripping? Is it better? Is it worse? Could you take your parents to a show? And right away, if you are someone who practices striptease, then you will have heard this conversation a million times before. And pretty much always the conclusion is burlesque is a classier form of stripping, it's a more elegant form of stripping, it's not as raunchy as traditional stripping. And I will be the first to admit that this article definitely stumbles into that. That being said, I do feel as though that is not the point of this article. I really don't think that this article wrote this section thinking, I'm going to compare burlesque to stripping because I think stripping is inherently worse. Yes, the article is comparing the two mediums, but I don't think it's really doing it maliciously. Of course, just because something is intended to be taken in a certain way doesn't mean that that's always the effect that it has. And if that makes you feel less or more critical of this article, then that's really up to you. But I just wanted to get that out there, that this feels like a far less malicious comparison than most I've seen from similar articles. And it is actually this point in particular that does kind of make me want to defend the article somewhat. Yes, articles like this will often pit burlesque and stripping against each other, whether intentionally to make some kind of political point about feminism and about nudity, or unintentionally, which I feel is the case here. And while that can be very annoying, and it often is, there is a reason for that, and I do feel it gets lost in the conversation a lot. And I'm going to tell you the reason. The reason is that a lot of people still don't really know what burlesque is. Most people out and about that you know have not been to a burlesque show, or they haven't seen it depicted in any kind of media in an accurate way. However, lots of people have been to strip shows, or have seen traditional stripping depicted in pop culture in some way, shape, or form. So if you're going to a burlesque show for the first time and your only understanding of striptease is through traditional stripping, I don't think it's crazy for the average person to compare the two. And the truth is that the majority of people who go to a burlesque show for the first time are probably going to have a reaction pretty similar to what this article described. They will take in the setting and the dance styles and the drink, and unfortunately they're not going to have the context to weigh burlesque and stripping in a very nuanced way. And again, I would argue that the way that this article frames the question in particular is actually more nuanced than most articles like this. Because in this particular case, the writer is not comparing burlesque and stripping as a whole, he's comparing his personal experience. He's someone who has gone to a strip show, didn't really like it, went to a burlesque show at the request of his girlfriend, and realized that this was a form of stripping that he enjoyed in particular. It's a much more personal take meant to reflect Montreal nightlife than it is to reflect on stripping and burlesque as a whole. Again, all of this is my opinion. I personally really like this article, but I understand why a lot of people are very critical of it. Anyways, that is simply one burlesque performer's opinion. Thank you so much for watching, and stay critical.